as long as the tariffs remain in place, ratification would be very, very problematic.
We're making progress, but we need to keep advocating on behalf of Canada.
I think we are close to an understanding with Mexico and Canada, but I can assure you it is a priority of ours.
U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum are staying in place for now. Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland was in Washington this afternoon for a series of high-level meetings, and she emerged from those meetings without any indication that a deal could be imminent. The CBC's Katie Simpson is here. I know you were following those developments. Tell us more about what Minister Freeland said as she emerged from those meetings.
It's very clear that more conversations appear to be necessary to resolve this issue that's been dragging on for nearly a year now. But we've certainly seen a lot of momentum from all three countries really caught in this particular dispute, trying to get to some sort of resolution. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had 2 phone calls with Donald Trump last week, one with Vice President Mike Pence as well. This issue came up in all 3 of those phone calls. Chrystia Freeland's had a series of phone calls with Robert Lighthizer, who is the U.S. Trade Representative, Donald Trump's top man on trade. And it amounted in this, it got to the point where Canada decided, okay, it's time to go down to Washington to have another face-to-face conversation with Bob Lighthizer, as well as other influential American lawmakers around this issue. But when Chrystia Freeland emerged from her high-level meetings, there's no breakthrough to announce. It's clear that more conversations need to happen. Have a listen.
The Canadian position remains as it has been from the very outset, that we believe that these tariffs need to be lifted. They need to be lifted for the benefit of both of our countries. And we had good conversations today with Ambassador Lighthizer, good conversations with Senator Grassley, we are going to continue to make the case as to why we think a full lift of the tariffs on both sides.
So as she's saying, you know, these conversations were positive, she did not reveal a lot about what was happening behind closed doors. But one thing she was very clear to do was to make the threat that from Canada's perspective, when we've heard a similar threat from Mexico, that if the Americans want Canada to ratify the new NAFTA agreement, it's going to be very problematic to do so if those tariffs remain in place. A number of American lawmakers are on Canada's side with this, trying to convince the White House to get on board to lift these tariffs and make it a priority. But the problem, from what I understand from my conversations with high-level sources, is straight in the White House, right in the Oval Office. Donald Trump is very satisfied with his tariffs. He regularly brags about them, even if the data doesn't back up his claims. And he's very comfortable with the position he's in right now.
And the tariffs we're referring to are those what we call a 232 tariffs, basically levied in the name of national security. We're going to explain a bit more about them later, but it's 10% on aluminum, 25% on steel. We saw what the Canadian officials are saying. What about the American officials? Because they were talking publicly today, too.
Well, there seems to be this very public campaign, whether it's by Mexico or the United States, to try and build some momentum around this. So we've talked a little bit about the behind-the-scenes momentum. But one thing I found very interesting is we saw some American reporters today talking about speaking on background with American officials. Robert Lighthizer and his team have been very careful not to leak information to American reporters, or any reporters for that matter, to try and stop the flow of information. So it was clear that they were trying to put a message out there to try and sort of build some momentum and pressure around this. Steve Mnuchin, who is Donald Trump's Secretary of the Treasury, he was in front of a Senate Finance Committee in the United States today, and he even added to some of that optimism we're starting to hear out of the United States that perhaps they are closer than Chrystia Freeland's letting on.
This is a very important part of passing USMCA, which is a very important economic agreement for 2 of our largest trading partners. So I think we are close to an understanding with Mexico and Canada. I've spoken to the finance ministers. Ambassador Lighthizer is leading the effort on this, but I can assure you it is a priority of ours.
The one thing that everyone watching this should caution, though, is at the end of the day, this is going to be a decision that will be made by Donald Trump. As we saw in NAFTA negotiations, there were a number of points where all 3 countries thought they were getting close to a deal and thought, you know, there had been momentum in building and there'd be a change in a deal, and then things would fall through at the last minute. We saw it in May of 2018, and then ultimately we even saw some weird sort of positioning when Mexico got a deal before Canada did, and all of that kind of positioning. At the end of the day, it will be up to Donald Trump, and it's Donald Trump that needs to be convinced the tariffs need to be lifted. Whether Canada's message is getting through is the big question.
And we should quickly mention that after Minister Freeland spoke to reporters and met with her counterpart in Washington, she headed off to Cuba.
Yes, so she's going to Cuba. There's going to be some high-level conversations about the crisis in Venezuela, as well as dealing with, of course, there's the health crisis for diplomats that they've been dealing with there. But that is also on her agenda. So don't expect her to come back to Canada to make any major announcements just yet on tariffs. Also, that might happen with Justin Trudeau. He's away in Paris right now. So we'll see how that sort of unfolds. If there is a deal right now, all indications, nothing that has been cemented.
Certainly an interesting diplomatic dimension there in Cuba.
Yes.
It'll be interesting to watch how that plays out. Thank you, Katie. The CBC's Katie Simpson. So, as we were talking about with all three countries in this sort of negotiation, what about Mexico? Are they really as close to a deal as has been reported? And if they are, what's in that deal? Earlier this afternoon, I spoke with Jesus Seade, Mexico's chief negotiator on trade, and more specifically, the chief negotiator for the new NAFTA agreement. Well, hello, Mr. Seade. Nice to see you.
Hello, Vashi. Nice to be with you.
I really appreciate it. I read a little bit earlier before this interview in the Globe and Mail that you said that that Mexico is close to a deal with the U.S. on removing those tariffs. Can you expand on that?
Steel, you mean?
Yes, steel tariffs.
Yeah. That's quite correct. We had inklings that this was possible right from the beginning, 6 months ago or something. But there just hasn't been much effort. We have been negotiating as countries through loudspeakers saying they have to lift this and they have to lift that. But 3 weeks ago, President López Obrador asked me, he told me, well, given that there are such links with the new NAFTA, with the COSMA, that I've been in charge of from the beginning, given the link, I want you to take charge of steel and see what's possible. So I began to talk to Ambassador Lighthizer in the United States, the chief negotiator for all trades, for all matters trade. And very quickly we have made tremendous progress. And I'm looking to an early resolution on the basis of lifting the tariffs, no quotas. We were getting close to an agreement, and I said to Ambassador Lighthizer, Bob, I really wouldn't want to come to a completion without touching base with Canada. We have to move with them. It's not a trilateral issue. It's a bilateral issue, also for you. But we are partners in the region. So I came here to talk to Minister Freeland yesterday, and it was a tremendously positive exchange. Right now, or just before the last 2 hours, she has been with Ambassador Lighthizer, and I hope the conversation went very well. As far as we're concerned, we are almost done.
Okay, I want to dig into a couple of things there because you mentioned that the deal would not involve quotas. Can you expand on that? Because what we have been hearing from Mr. Lighthizer, especially when he testifies before committee, is that some kind of quota might be necessary. You're saying that you'll be able to arrive at a deal to lift those tariffs without quotas.
That was what we were hearing from him the last 6 months also. When I began to talk to him, we very quickly moved from quotas to tariff quotas. These are flexible quotas that if you hit the ceiling, you can continue exporting, but with a higher tax. Okay, they're called tariff rate quotas. But then we moved on, and I think our intention now, my intention now, is to get to a deal without any quotas.
Even those types that allow for, so even the ones you're describing, the ones that allow for...
No, not even that, exactly. That's kind of, stage 2 is quotas that can be fair or unfair. So I started saying, okay, let's go for fair quotas. Then we moved to flexible quotas, which is a much better proposition. But now we're talking about no quotas.
What moved
Of course, with some discipline.
What does that mean? Yeah.
Well, a joint monitoring. A monitoring of trade flows, in particular to make sure that there's no triangulation, that you import lots of stuff from Korea or from some neighbor of Korea.
You mean no dumping?
No dumping, but I'm talking about something else now. I'm saying that you buy cheap steel from Korea or from the European Union or from China, and then you just transform it and increase your sales to the United States. So no triangulation. Any production that is domestic, that is legitimate, is fine. So some discipline, some joint monitoring of the industry. And everybody preserves the right to take action, protective action. If you're subsidizing, I will protect my industry. But this is normal. So just doing the normal in a kind of joint supervision way to avoid problems.
So help us understand how you were able to get to that point versus the rhetoric that we have heard in the lead up. What changed at the table, do you think?
Maybe that we talked. Maybe.
Really?
Yeah, just trying to explore avenues, and Ambassador Lighthizer is, I think interested in a resolution. We've heard voices or noises from the United States long ago from legislators or from industry saying how bad these things are. So just as Canada has said, we cannot ratify the COSMA with those duties in place, the same has been said in Mexico, and I think the same has been said at least by many people in the US. So it was just a question of making the effort, reaching out, and I think it's in the interest of everybody.
Was that the message that you delivered explicitly to Mr. Lighthizer, that NAFTA would not be ratified in Mexico without the lifting of those tariffs?
Absolutely, absolutely. That we have made very clear to him, to the public, to my legislators as my advice, because they ratify whatever they want to ratify. But I think that there's a consensus in Mexico. We cannot do this with the duties in place.
Are you concerned that while Mr. Lighthizer might be receptive to that message, President Trump will not be?
Well, let's see.
Have you had any indications?
President Trump, quite rightly, places a lot of confidence in Mr. Lighthizer. Lighthizer is really a superb expert, negotiator, very honest also. He has the industry of the United States at heart as much as President Trump. He just sees that this is not inconsistent. It's in the mutual interest. So he has to convince his boss.
And when you say that you spoke to Minister Freeland yesterday, and you were careful to say that you're waiting a bit for Canada, but that it's not a trilateral agreement. So if Minister Freeland comes out today and she has no movement, like you've seen with Mr. Lighthizer, is Mexico prepared to move ahead with a deal?
Well, probably yes, partly because our industry is really desperate. I don't know what is the dynamics in Canada. But my industry is really desperate, and if we can get a result in a number of days or in 2 weeks more than that, I will be under pressure to do it in the former, whatever number of days, next week or whatever it is. We have to finalize. But we have to see. I hope Canada is also coming to completion quickly. I personally don't see a reason why not, but I'm not Canadian.
But you won't. But for example, just so that I'm clear, you won't hinge a deal between Mexico and the U.S. on whether Canada can reach a deal as well. They will remain separate.
Well, this was never part of a trilateral treaty. These are separate commercial difficulties. Just as you have lumber, and we have not lumber problems, and we have tomato, and you don't have tomato problems. In this case, we happen to have a problem in the same products. But these are individual problems. This is bilateral by nature.
But they're tied to the new NAFTA, which is
trilateral. Only tied politically.
But politics are a big part of this.
Exactly. But we are saying we cannot ratify, partly because they were introduced, obviously, to induce Canada and Mexico to negotiate, blah, blah, blah. But it's not technically part of that. So, I mean, if we come to a conclusion at the same time, and it is possible to sign something that covers the three countries, it'll be fantastic. So we make it trilateral.
But you're not going to wait out
it is not in essence something of that nature. So okay. It's something that we have to resolve ASAP.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Sade.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
Great pleasure.
Thank you, sir. So what are 232 tariffs exactly, and what do they aim to do? Here's a reminder. Imposed a 25% tariff on imported steel. That means the steel sold to the U.S. gets a 25% tax slapped on it, making it more expensive to import. A 10% tariff was also slapped on imported aluminum. Canada and Mexico were exempted at first, but on June 1st, that exemption was terminated. U.S. President Trump authorized the tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. It says the president can put restrictions on imports that, quote, threaten to impair national security. The argument is countries are dumping goods into the U.S., and that could shrink the American manufacturing sector, which in turn would endanger its ability to arm its own national defense. That's an argument, however, Canada firmly rejects.
The Canadian position remains as it has been from the very outset, that we believe that these tariffs need to be lifted. They need to be lifted for the benefit of both of our countries.
Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland is in Washington, or she was earlier this afternoon, for a series of high-level meetings, and she emerged from them without any indication a deal could be imminent. But Mexico says it's close to an agreement with the U.S. to have those tariffs removed. So what does that tell us? Mary Scott Greenwood is a former U.S. diplomat to Canada and CEO of the Canadian-American Business Council. She's joining us from Washington. And here with me in studio is Sarah Goldfeder. She's a principal at Earnscliffe Strategy Group and a former special assistant to 2 U.S. ambassadors to Canada. Hi to both of you. Great to see you. Scotty, I'll start with you, because the big news out of today was Mexico saying, and we had the chief trade negotiator on here saying that he feels like they are imminently close to a deal, one in which there would be no quotas. How realistic do you think that is?
Well, I'm really excited and encouraged to hear what's coming from the Mexican government. And I will tell you what I also heard them say is they've been negotiating in earnest, which we know to be true, but that they pushed the pause button in order to make sure that Canada hopefully could reach a similar, if not the same exact deal. So I take that as a very positive sign that we're trying to go for kind of trilateral alignment on this issue. And I'm pretty optimistic reading the tea leaves coming out of today, to be honest.
So, Sarah, Scotty's correct that yes, they're pressing the pause button, but they're not pressing the stop button. And Mr. Seade was very clear that they won't wait. Right. On tariffs, yes, on tariffs specifically, that they won't wait for. I mean, they hope that Canada can reach a similar agreement, but that if the rubber hits the road, they're facing pressure from industry, and they would have to sign an agreement on that.
And they have different pressures than Canada has. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that when and I don't necessarily know this, but my bet is that when Minister Freeland went in today to talk to Ambassador Lighthizer, the talk on tariffs, the talk on trade wasn't just focused on what was happening on the USMCA and the 232s. That I'm pretty sure that in order to kind of reach an agreement that domestically works for this federal government, they're also going to have to talk about China, and they're going to need some support on China. And they're in a position right now where the United States wants something from Canada. They want them to come to an agreement. They've shown some space on 232s, and this is great. I do think that the Americans are they're suffering from a little bit of pressure on how many things they're trying to combat and deal with all at once. And so just USTR itself, between USMCA, China, working on EU, Japan, and the UK, the low-hanging fruit there, the easiest one to come to conclusion on is clearly the USMCA. So if they can make that work through a removal of tariffs, that's great. But I can see why it might not be moving at the same pace as Mexico, because there are some other considerations for Canada that would have to be, this is the moment to deal with them.
Scotty, would you agree that there is a China factor here?
Well, China is absolutely a factor for everybody in the world right now. But, look, I think in terms of the Mexico-Canada dynamic, if the shoe were on the other foot, if Canada were on the verge of having a deal to lift the steel and aluminum tariffs altogether, Canada would take that deal. Canada's been very clear about that. So
it's a safe bet, I think, yeah.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I really hope we get there, because it is quite important to try to get this deal over the goal line. I agree with Sarah that the most logical thing, the thing that's furthest along in terms of U.S. trade policy, is the USMCA, the new NAFTA, if you will. But it's not easy. I mean, you still have the House Democrats. And what I like, though, today is that Ambassador Lighthizer met with Speaker Pelosi. So it's great that he met with Minister Freeland, but it's almost more significant, to be honest, that he's meeting with House Democrats. So if we can get a deal done, and done soon, that gives Canada time to pass it potentially, if we really hurry up, before the House rises.
On the tariffs, though, Sarah, like domestically, what kind of factors are at play in the calculation for President Trump? Because we have heard him be very, and I keep saying, I feel like I'm a broken record, but he is almost a broken record. I don't mean that in a bad way, but he talks about tariffs very much, that they are effective and they are great tools in negotiation. He doesn't seem to be moving from that point of view. Why might there be space, though, in what is arrived at with Canada or Mexico?
Well, he has a win on USMCA, so that's part of the deal. So in order to make the USMCA work, it's not just Canada and Mexico that have said you're not going to get this passed without lifting the 232 tariffs. It's Americans that have said that as well, within the House and within the Senate. And so, like Scotty said, it's huge that he's sitting down with the Democrats, and he's not just sitting down with the Democrats and saying to the Democrats, okay, so what do we do about 232s? How do we get this through? He's saying to them, all right, let me listen to all the issues that you have. I know you have issues that you don't feel have been addressed adequately within this agreement. Let's talk about those. Let's find some way to negotiate out a solution on all of those pieces. And so I think that there's outreach from the USTR, both internally in the United States and externally to Mexico and Canada, which says to me that things are moving at a far more rapid pace than they have in the last few months. And I think that for President Trump, focusing on China is giving him the space to give a little bit of room on tariffs on 232s just for Mexico and for Canada. And if you combine that with the rumors of the discussion on 232s on auto tariffs eventually coming out as well, I mean, he's got a lot of tariffs. So there may be a spot for him to give up the ones on steel and aluminum with Mexico and with Canada and not necessarily have that as a loss on the ledger.
What about, Scotty, I'd love for you to weigh in on the idea that there might not be quotas involved in this, because Ambassador Lighthizer had been pretty unequivocal in his appearances before various committees that that's what they were looking for, some sort of managed trade. Now we see that the Mexican trade negotiator was saying, well, I was even willing to go to flexible quotas. That looked okay, but we got beyond that and we might not have any quotas. Instead, we might just be looking at some sort of mechanism for tracking where imports and exports are going.
Right. So I think what happened in the interim is that stakeholders, business leaders, people that know a lot about how this works and who actually use the steel and aluminum on a daily basis spoke up and said quotas don't work. Quote, we can't live with that. So I think what all three governments have been hearing from the business community, from our members and from others is, when a few months ago when there was a discussion about managed trade or tariff quota rates or all of that, the business community said, wait, hang on a second, this doesn't work. There isn't a quota big enough that will satisfy us based on the way business works. And I think, you got to give the governments credit if they get to a resolution of this, that they were listening to the people who actually use the steel and aluminum on a daily basis.
And there was one other piece to this too that Minister Seade mentioned when he spoke to you earlier, and that's the tracing part of it, right? And so I think that's something we have to keep in mind is that both Canada and Mexico have been talking about how do we ensure that we have a secure chain of custody on steel so that we know where all of the steel that's coming into our country is coming from, and when it leaves our country that we can identify that. So Innovative Solutions Canada put out an announcement back in December about for an RFP, their problem-based RFPs, where they ask for companies to come to them with a solution on how to track the different aspects of steel through the industry. So if there is a mechanism that Mexico and Canada can bring to the United States and say, hey, look, here's something that we can work on together to ensure that the steel that we're using in North America is, for the majority part North American and is only coming from other countries when it absolutely has to. That might be something that's particularly attractive to Bob Lighthizer right now.
It's just interesting that is coming now nearly a year after the tariffs were first levied, when you would imagine that discussion could, Scotty, sorry, that discussion could have happened earlier, but I'm not blaming anyone for that. I'm just saying it's interesting.
Well, Vashti, if I could just jump in, the other thing that's interesting and I have to say quite frustrating, and Ambassador McNaughton is incredibly eloquent and frustrated on this, is when you look at the tariffs on steel and aluminum and you look at the exemptions to them, China actually has garnered far more in exemptions than Mexico or Canada. So,
and when we say far, it's like in the 98% of their exports have been exempted and 2% of Canadian.
Right. And by the way, the target all along wasn't really Canada or Mexico. The target was other countries that are more adversarial in terms of dumping materials like steel and aluminum, and China has been historically a big offender in that regard. So it's pretty frustrating, quite frustrating, I would say, to the Canadian government, the Mexican government, that the actual outcome of these tariffs is something that doesn't actually punish China, but it punishes Canada and Mexico. So I think there's progress. I hope there's progress, and I appreciate what our neighbors, South and North, are doing to try to encourage the administration to do the right thing. The business community here in the United States is very vocal on this as well. It's awfully important to business certainty and to making big capital investments and all of that. So I hope we're getting somewhere.
All right. I think there's a lot of people hoping that. Thank you very much to both of you. Really appreciate your time. Thanks to Mary Scott Greenwood and Sarah Goldfeder.
Thanks, Vashti. Good to be with you.
Great to see you guys.
So I began to talk to Ambassador Lighthizer in the United States, the chief negotiator for all trades, for all matters trade. And very quickly we have made tremendous progress. And I'm looking to an early resolution on the basis of lifting the tariffs, no quotas. President Trump, quite rightly, places a lot of confidence in Mr. Lighthizer. Lighthizer is really a superb expert, negotiator, very honest also. He just sees that this is not inconsistent. It's in the mutual interest. So he has to convince his boss.
Chief Mexican trade negotiator Jesus Seade says he's close to a deal, as you just heard, a deal that would see the U.S. lift steel and aluminum tariffs it imposed on Mexico last year. But those tariffs, you'll remember, were also imposed on Canadian steel and aluminum. So what happens if Canada doesn't get an agreement of its own? It's time for the Power Panel. In Montreal, former Quebec Liberal Environment Minister David Ertel. And here with me in studio, Tim Powers of Summa Strategies, Earnscliffe Strategy Group's Kathleen Monk, and host of CBC Radio's The House, Chris Hall. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Hello.
So let's play a little bit of compare and contrast, because right after we did that interview, Chrystia Freeland, our Foreign Affairs Minister, had just met with Robert Lighthizer in the U.S. and in Washington. She came out and spoke to reporters. Let's have a listen to what she had to say about those talks.
We believe that these tariffs need to be lifted. They need to be lifted for the benefit of both of our countries. We are glad that we have achieved an agreement on the new NAFTA. And we very much think that free trade in steel and aluminum should be a part of that agreement.
So Kathleen, a little bit of two different tales that we're hearing there to a certain degree. Mexico seems very optimistic, as you heard from the trade negotiator there, that there's a deal, and not only a deal, but one that would not impose quotas. Which is what had been sort of speculated. It's not like Chrystia Freeland came out and said, hey guys, let's look forward to a deal that's on the way.
No, she was certainly not as optimistic. It's interesting, right? Because Mexico's chief negotiator, Jesus Seade, he actually has a very close relationship with Lighthizer that goes back quite a long time. So he has the inside track there in many ways. And he, like in 2018, and Katie and you spoke about this earlier, I think, in the day, is leading the charge on kind of getting the deal done, the NAFTA deal done, and now getting the lifting of the tariffs done. What this means for the Liberals, what this means for elections, I think that's a more interesting political question. You know, there is nothing except a full lifting of the tariffs that will make the Liberals comfortable. So the question is, do they want to keep, do they want to rush into a deal, get something that may have quotas, even though Mr. Seade said no quotas, no quotas, no quotas. Because they risk that, or do they want to keep the tariffs and the bludgeon against the U.S. for the election period?
Good question.
Yeah, we do some work with a lot of companies in the steel industry and represent the Steel Association. I think they've heard the Mexican trade representatives interview and are glad to hear that perhaps there are no quotas, but until that comes out of Chrystia Freeland's mouth, they're not going to be comforted. It's not something I think they think would be a very useful thing for their business unless the quota was such a high enough number that it would never be met. I mean, it is still
to be fair, even in Mexico's case, until we hear from President Trump's mouth too,
yeah,
right?
That's fair. I think, again, there's a fascinating element to all of this, and again, it may be because of the personal relationship that the Americans always seem to get deals with Mexico first. God, that's a change. It used to be the Canadians and the Americans were doing this, and I think that is a major point of criticism that Chrystia Freeland, Prime Minister Trudeau are going to have to deal with on a go-forward basis. It's good to have a separation with President Trump, but in the end, they're our principal economic partner, and there's a legitimate critique to be had there. I agree with Kathleen. They need a deal. I mean, there's 6,000 jobs on the table here, arguably, and also as it relates to market conditions, the longer this goes on, this is all priced in. Commercial decisions are being made about whether to continue operating businesses. If there are more layoffs that come, more plants that have to lay people off, that's not going to be good for the Liberals heading into the election campaign.
No.
Just very quickly, I think this has been true from the very beginning. Mexico had more leverage over the United States and Donald Trump, whether it was interdictions on drug enforcement on the southern border, or corn, which is a major export to Mexico, and those are states in the Midwest that Trump dominated. So he needed to listen to them more. To the point here about hard caps or quotas on steel imports versus, I think what Mexico is talking about is some kind of monitoring system to ensure that steel from the EU, from Japan, from Korea, from China doesn't get dumped Trump through Canada or Mexico and the United States might actually solve this. I think the biggest issue for Donald Trump right now is that there is going to be no ratification of this deal in the Senate. Not just Democrats holding up, but Republicans too, who want this done. Chuck Grassley being the most vocal of all of them. So he's under some pressure at home to get this deal done. There's an intense lobbying effort underway now with the steel industry and others. Like, we need this deal. The auto sector is involved in it. So it wouldn't surprise me if Freeland is taking her time, playing what she has here, which is basically, we are still looking for something perhaps to be able to sell to Canadians. But I think right now it's looking far more optimistic than it has at any other point.
David, as far as the ratification of the new NAFTA or USMA or USMCA, whatever you want to call it, goes, do you think it is something? I mean, it's an interesting question to look forward. They certainly had the benefit of the win when the agreement was made, the federal Liberals. Do you think that if it isn't ratified, if there isn't any formal movement forward on it, that they will in turn wear that during the election?
Well, they're going to have to, and also the elephant in the room is still China. Because right now, if you look the past few days, you had Larry Kudlow, who's President Trump's top economic advisor, saying on Fox News on Sunday that tariffs hurt the U.S. economy. You had today Treasury Secretary Mnuchin saying in a Senate hearing that things are looking optimistic about a deal with Canada and Mexico. And I think right now, with the way the trade war is ramping up with China, and Donald Trump wants to have that fight with China, but you've seen, if you looked, as I did, to my RRSP over the past few days, and people in the U.S. are looking at their 401ks. I mean, and you're looking at key states for Donald Trump for the re-elect in 2020. You're looking at Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. They're primary trade partners with Canada. And so if you have tariffs with Canada and with China, that's a double whammy that I don't think Donald Trump wants. He doesn't need a fight with Canada. There's nothing to generate his base with a war against Canada, but he needs the war against China. So I think with the way the reaction of the markets to what's going on with China is happening, I think President Trump is looking for a way out with Canada. But if there's no way out, well, yeah, the Liberals here are going to have to wear it, definitely.
Although it's interesting that he is so adamant. I mean, there is such a conversation, and you're right, it has elevated among people who are his closest advisors around the negative possible impacts of tariffs. But he is still touting them quite actively as a most essential and beneficial negotiating tool.
He's telling people it's putting people back to work, it's helping industry, it's driving our economy. That's why the economy's on fire. And it's not just him, because even people have come out, like Pat Buchanan recently, and said that taxes, are the thing, tariffs, are the things that make America great, and turning back to that messaging again. And you have to think that with Trump and his idea that, and this is really a line from my colleague Sarah Goldfeder, who you'll hear from later in the show, but her analysis coming from a U.S. perspective is this, that Trump is focused on the American economy. He doesn't care about the North American economy. So he wants to focus on bringing back the jobs industry back there. And so maybe he might continue to say, no, I'm not going to get a deal.
And I've also read a lot of analysis that the economy is still has handled the weight of the tariffs, right? Like, it's still performing above expectations. And we know from other analysis that those tariffs won't, for a while, especially the Chinese ones, start to hit the consumers. They will eventually, and maybe the story will change then. But right now, it's not like the economy is faltering at the weight of these tariffs.
It pains me to say this, but Chris said something prescient, and that was...
it happens often.
It happens often. That's why he's such a good host. Teasing him, of course, but the Mexicans have leverage. Well, Canada used to have leverage. Interdiction that Chris talked about is not a new thing. It's more of an issue with this president, but it's always been something that American presidents, dating back to the Bushes and the war on drugs, has been a key item. Canada has to figure out, and David may have foreshadowed it, where it has leverage with this president. And I don't think we've not done a good enough job of doing that just yet. Whether it is those border states that David mentioned, whether there are opportunities that are at play there.
Although, to be fair to them, their counter tariffs, the retaliatory tariffs, were very much aimed at certain products in certain states where, you know, in the midterms, there was some thought of that.
I was talking to a couple of people who are, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
I'm waiting for another prescient offer.
Go ahead. We're so Canadian.
Talking to some Republicans in the United States, you know, Donald Trump's keenly aware that we're entering into an election cycle.
Oh, absolutely.
He also knows that the Progressive Conservative or the Conservative Party of Canada, you know, is talking in a different way about things like missile defense. He's not unaware, and people around him are not unaware of these things. So actually, how keen is he to let Canada twist a bit? And to your question about we need to find a way to have some leverage, maybe Donald Trump isn't actually all that interested anymore in worrying about a deal with Justin Trudeau. Maybe he's thinking maybe in October there could be something else to work with.
David, you're nodding. Quick final word to you.
Well, definitely, but also, again, back to the China piece, also part of Chrystia Freeland's maybe less optimistic tone is about the fact that on Canada's table, there's the whole Huawei situation and the tariffs. So that's part of the discussion. So there's a lot more pressure on Canada. As we said, it's at the end of a mandate. Well, Mexico is just beginning a new mandate.
Yeah.
There's a new president. They have time. They can work with time, and they can actually outlast Trump politically if he loses in 2020. Here we don't have that luxury. So Chrystia Freeland has also, with this kind of piece of leverage that she has, it's not a lot, but she needs also to talk about China and see how she can find a way out for Canada on the Chinese impasse.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.